Are stadium subsidies worth it? How about steel and aluminum tariffs? What even is a grocery store? I'm Dominic Pino, Thomas L. Rhodes Journalism Fellow with the National Review Institute, and we'll look at those questions on this episode of Econception. Econception is a podcast of the American Institute for Economic Research that looks at the economic issues of the day and broader economic concepts behind them. We're recording today on location from a vacant 50,000-seat stadium. We apologize for any stray echoes that might make it into the recording. This year's AFC playoffs featured both the Buffalo Bills and the Kansas City Chiefs going very far. Both of them were the subject of recent stadium subsidy controversies, deals where local governments would give the teams money in order to keep them in the city or just to build them a new stadium, even if they weren't planning on leaving anyway. Washington, D.C. is currently mired in such a controversy. Both the city's football stadium and the arena for its basketball and hockey teams are subject to stadium subsidy controversies. These issues have the potential to divide local governments, divide local residents, but they don't divide economists. Economists increasingly across the board see stadium subsidies as a poor use of taxpayer money, as an ineffective way to generate economic growth, and as ultimately corporate welfare and handouts to corporations that are already making billions of dollars. Our guest today is John Mozena. John is the president of the Center for Economic Accountability, a group based in Michigan that advocates free market reforms to economic development initiatives in local governments across the country, and state governments as well, I should say. And John is a leading critic of stadium subsidies, and so we want to hear why it is that economists are so united against these handouts to sports teams. So thanks so much for being here, John.
Thank you for having me.
So I guess let's just start off with the most obvious question. Why is it the case that economists are so united on this? Usually we're used to hearing economists arguing with each other, nitpicking each other's data and methodology, and finding ways to disagree. But increasingly on this issue, they're all on the same page. What is it that is so obvious about this?
In part, it's because they can just look at what the reality is. It's one thing to be looking ahead at trying to predict future things or money supply, all this sort of stuff. The thing about stadium subsidies is that there are just decades and decades of real world case studies being run. You can look at what happened in cities that built them versus cities that didn't, on cities that paid for them versus cities that didn't. And you can see what the minimal real world impact of these things is. The easiest way to explain the mechanism for why that's true, there's a couple different reasons, but the easiest one to explain is that building a stadium doesn't put any more money in local families' entertainment budgets. Stadiums are essentially a part of the sort of entertainment industry, or they are competing for people's entertainment and recreation dollars. And that if you build a stadium, it's not like it magically creates a whole lot of new economic activity in the city or in the region. All it really does is it changes where that happens. It's shifting where somebody's spending their family's money. If that makes sense. I mean, if you think about it, okay, well, I'm going to spend a couple $100 on going to taking the family to a football game or a baseball game. Well, that's money you don't then have to spend at movie theaters or bowling alleys or anything like that. A beer you drink at the stadium, $18 beer, whatever they are, is $18 worth of beer you're not drinking at some local restaurant or anything like that. So that is the primary thing, is that overwhelmingly it is the sort of, as economists say, the things that are seen versus the things that are not seen. We see the activity at the stadium. What we don't see is all the activity that is not happening elsewhere in the region.
So when local government is confronted with a decision about whether to subsidize a stadium, one of the things that the teams will often say is, look, we can pick up the team, we can move to a different city if we want to, but in order for us to stay here, we would like tax benefits. We would like direct subsidies, whatever the issue might be. The argument that you just made is about within the city, within that area, people are, they only have so much money that they're going to spend on entertainment. If they don't spend it in one place, they'll spend it in another place. It's really just a wash. But what if the team just completely gets up and leaves and goes to a different city? Now, all of that activity that they had is going to go benefit another city. And so if you're the mayor of the city that it's leaving, you would want them to stay there. And so what is the problem with that angle of it, too, when you broaden the analysis out to multiple cities and not just within one area?
Well, the issue is that we have a very distorted view. The average person has an extremely distorted view of how much economic activity a stadium creates, especially when you compare it to other kinds of businesses. We think of stadiums, and I should say I'm a giant sports fan. I'm a season ticket holder for local sports here in Detroit. I'm a humongous sports fan. This has nothing to do with being like anti-sports or anything like that. I'm still riding high from the University of Michigan's national championship. Go Blue. A little cranky about the Lions losing in the NFC playoff game. That being said, we all think of stadiums as these incredibly busy, vibrant places with all this stuff going on around them because that's what they're like when we go there, which is for a few hours on game day. The reality is that, and as anyone who's lived or worked near a stadium can tell you from personal experience, overwhelmingly, stadiums spend almost their entire lives just dark, empty, and silent. They are buildings that are used incredibly infrequently, and that shows up in the amount of economic impact they have. One good way to look at this is just to look at how many customers these buildings are serving. So consider like the number of fans who come in for events in a year versus the number of customers that some other kind of business would serve over the course of a year. So 365 days or so. Even the busiest stadiums, which tend to be Major League Baseball stadiums because they have 81 home games in a season. In MLB, 3 million fans is sort of generally considered the yardstick for a really good year of attendance. You get 3 million fans, that's a really good year of attendance. 3 million customers is about what a single, busy Walmart supercenter might serve in a year. So that's not nothing. That's a decent chunk of business in your community, but it's also not worth $1 billion or more of subsidies to achieve that. Other sports, even less. My favorite, the average NFL attendance for a season is roughly equal to the annual customer count of the average American supermarket. An NBA or an NHL team might serve as many customers in a year roughly as a decent-sized gas station with convenience store. And when you get down to the smaller leagues, where even then there's still folks spending, tens of millions of dollars on stadiums for these. I once did the math on a minor league baseball team in New England and found that the customer count would be equal to the customer count of a single Dunkin' Donuts franchise in the region. They were trying to drop $40 million on a stadium there. So the fact is that these stadiums are busy for just a few hours on game days and are dark and empty the rest of the time. And that makes them really bad at economic impact when compared to virtually any other profitable and active use of that land.
That can all be true, but cities also believe that stadiums bring a certain status to the city as well, because it is sort of a marker that people have in their heads about, is a city a big city? Is it a place where stuff is happening? Do they have a stadium there? Is kind of one of the things that sort of separates major cities from smaller cities in people's conception. And so there might be an incentive there for politicians to say, look, even if the dollars and cents don't work out, it's worth it for the status that our city has in the eyes of visitors, in the eyes of people that are coming, and it gives us a venue that is available to host really large events if we need it. And if there is a really large event that wants to come in, whether it's a concert, whether it's a political convention, whether it's any kind of traveling sporting event that happens on neutral sites, we want to be able to have a site where that can happen. Is that argument, do you think, persuasive?
No, because those arguments, I think, generally get cause and effect reversed. Cities don't become big league. They don't become successful because they've got a stadium there. If they did, Green Bay, Wisconsin would be a bustling metropolis. It's had an NFL stadium longer than virtually any other city in the United States, and it's still, no intentional disrespect to Green Bay, but it's still kind of a backwater. Stadiums go where the population is. If you look at where sort of teams have moved in recent years, you see that they're going to places that are growing. They're putting an MLS team in Austin, Texas. They've put a basketball team in Oklahoma City. The nature of sports, again, sports is an entertainment business, and entertainment businesses go to where the population is, and they go to where the economy is to follow along. In Nashville before that, Jacksonville getting the Jaguars. You look at the list of growing metro areas, and those tend to be the places where teams are going to. When the NHL started putting a whole bunch of teams in the South because that's where the growth was, and they were worried that if they kept all the hockey teams up where we actually have ice, that the sport would die because they wouldn't be following where the population is. So that's the thing, is that these teams, sports teams, are not going to the places that offer them the biggest subsidies. Sports teams are going to where they can make the most money. Nobody thought LA wasn't a big league city because for a long time it didn't have an NFL team. Like, that wasn't something that was holding Los Angeles back. And it's notable that when Los Angeles got not just one but two NFL teams in the same stadium, that stadium was built with billions of dollars in private money because Los Angeles recognized that it didn't need the NFL to be a big league city. And the owner said, you know what, fine, I will build my own stadium and do a very nice job of it, and then win the Super Bowl there with my Rams because that's just good business for me to do. I mean, the idea that you need a subsidized stadium either to attract a team or to win, which is often one of the arguments that gets made, that teams can't be competitive if they have to spend money on their own stadium when everybody else is getting them for free. Well, the Rams won the Super Bowl in the stadium they built themselves. And the Las Vegas Golden Knights Stanley Cup parade passed about a block from where they're talking about building the new stadium for the formerly, or maybe still, still don't know for sure, Oakland A's. And the Golden Knights had paid for their own arena. The owners in the industry don't like to talk about all the places where these folks are paying for their own things because it undercuts their arguments. But it does, in fact, happen. It happens less often than it should, but it certainly doesn't happen all of the time. And the folks that do it still manage to win pretty consistently.
What about cities that aren't where the people are going, but still have teams right now? Places like, you mentioned Green Bay. Green Bay is sort of a one-off, though, because of their unusual ownership structure. But if you take teams like the Buffalo Bills, for example, Buffalo not being a very big city, but they've had this team for a long time. If the Bills owners wanted to go to where the people are going, they would probably take the team out of Buffalo, right? So does it make sense for, it might not make sense for a Los Angeles or a Las Vegas to subsidize their stadium, but would it make more sense for a local government that's looking to keep a team in a smaller market when a larger market could be available elsewhere?
I mean, to some extent, I understand at a gut level why people do that. Again, I'm a gigantic sports fan. If, up until the past few seasons, I would have almost begged someone to take the Lions away from Detroit, given all the pain they'd caused us. But that's thankfully turned around a little bit in recent years. The reality is again, that teams leave places that are willing to pay them. I mean, Oakland was in fact willing to subsidize the A's. It's just the owner really, really preferred to be someplace else. And that, again, that's still an open question about whether or not that's actually going to happen, because there's a lot of questions about whether or not he's got the money to hold up his side of it. Plus, there's an ongoing lawsuit about the way that the money was appropriated. Interestingly, led by the teachers union in Nevada. One of the growing areas of opposition to these deals is, in fact, the public sector unions have started to realize that all of the money that gets abated out of these tax deals is money that can't be going to pay teachers and AFSCME employees and all those sorts of folks. So it's an interesting coalition in this world. But the reality is that businesses are going to do what's best for them. Businesses are going to do what makes business sense. And if it doesn't make sense, if they could make more money in, moving the Bills to, I don't know, Salt Lake City or, Austin or someplace else, they're going to do it even if they get $1 billion in stadium subsidies, because they'll get that same money someplace else or something probably fairly close to it. It's also worth noting that for all that there are, really passionate Bills fans, their polling showed that even in Western New York, even in like Bills country, the public was still, I think that I'm remembering off the top of my head, but it was fairly significant, almost 60-40 against that subsidy deal. Because again, the number of people who actually go to a Bills game in a year is a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the population, but everybody ends up paying for it. So the sports fans might be loud and they might be passionate, but the average person who doesn't go to the stadium, who doesn't benefit from that, they are seeing this incredible cost. And this is real money for all of the efforts by the teams and their hired gun economic consultants to claim that, oh, it's free money, oh, it's getting paid back, oh, there's all this economic impact. People get that there isn't such a thing as a free lunch, and that the goal of doing these things is not to make sure that there's ROI for the community as a whole.
That is one of the arguments that is often made in favor of stadium subsidies, is that they pay for themselves, that the economic activity that will come in, or the tax revenue that will be raised as a result of the stadium, as a result of all of the people paying sales tax on things, as a result of the taxes that the team pays, et cetera, that money will be recouped over time. Does that actually bear out? That's what the people say beforehand as a projection. But what actually happens when we look back on past examples and see, with the benefit of hindsight, how does it actually happen?
No, it doesn't. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Often to begin with, the entire sort of economic impact industry, both for stadiums and for sort of economic development subsidies as a whole, is I don't think I'm being unkind in calling it a giant scam. I joke sometimes that it's now we know what happened to all of the tobacco industry people who used to come up with the smoking is good for you studies back in my youth. Whenever these get deconstructed publicly, you find things where they make just these insane assumptions where they just only counted benefits and didn't count costs, a favorite one, that sort of ignore the broken window fallacy and don't recognize the fact that you've already got a stadium. The cost of they're treated as if it's this greenfield and not the fact of you could just keep playing in the 20-year-old stadium you have. There's been this giant wave of stadium deals where literally the stadiums are 20 years old. I mean, I've got a 19-year-old son and I'm not ready to replace him yet. The stadium is the same. I mean, one good way to look at this is that in terms of this increasing speed of this and the increasing cost of these deals, is that Michael Farron, formerly of the Mercatus Center, and his colleague Ann Philpott there estimated a couple of years ago that between 2000 and 2016, there was $13 billion in municipal bond debt taken on across the country for stadium subsidies. In the past 2 years, since just 2022, remember, $13 billion from that 16 years of the since 2022, there have been just under $5.5 billion in deals approved, and there's another, and it's always sort of fuzzy, another sort of $10 billion or so that are currently underway. So we have the potential for, I guess, yes, inflation and everything else, but in the space of 2 years, putting up a price tag for stadium subsidies that it took us a decade and a half to get not that long ago. The speed and the price tag of these deals is increasing. I mean, again, you talked about the Bills. That was the first $1 billion stadium subsidy. The Chicago White Sox are currently floating the first $2 billion stadium subsidy a year later. And there's other, the arena in Northern Virginia is $1.5 billion. Kansas City is $1 to $2 billion. St. Petersburg's $1.5 billion. Once they sort of broke that $1 billion price line, we sort of went past that mental thing, and it's going up and up and up. And that's really the good thing, from my perspective, is that the average person is starting to look at this and go, this doesn't seem right. This doesn't seem smart. And that's where I think the hope lies in this.
Absolutely. This is an area where the populist argument and the free market argument are in many cases the same argument, because this is a free market person looks at this and says, this is corporate welfare for companies that already have $1 billion. They don't need more taxpayer money handed out to them in order to do economic activity that oftentimes does not add anything to the local economy, is not an efficient use of government resources, and takes away from taxpayers and from private individuals, which they would use the money for much more productive activity. And a populist might just look at this and say, why are these rich guys getting stuff that I don't get? And both of those arguments in this situation are completely compatible with each other. It doesn't make any sense for rich guys to get this money. And I think you've done a good job of illustrating that for us today. Thanks so much, John, for talking to us.
Absolutely.
On the previous episode of Econception, we talked about the proposed merger between JetBlue and Spirit Airlines and the government's efforts to block it. This time, let's talk about a different proposed merger between the grocery store companies Kroger and Albertsons. The Federal Trade Commission under Chairwoman Lena Khan announced it will seek to block the merger. Each company operates several different brand names across the country. Kroger is based in Cincinnati, and aside from its namesake grocery store, operates Dillon's, Harris Teeter, Roundy's, Mariano's, and several other chains. Albertsons is based in Boise, and aside from its namesake, also operates Safeway, Acme, Jewel Osco, Vons, and others. Kroger and Albertsons are currently two of the largest grocery store companies in the U.S. Some lists will show them as the top two, but there's one tricky question. What counts as a grocery store? If Walmart is a grocery store, then it's bigger than Kroger or Albertsons. Obviously, Walmart does lots of other stuff that those companies don't do, but you could do all your grocery shopping in a Walmart supercenter. Is Costco a grocery store? The ability to buy in bulk at a lower price entices many families with several kids to shop there for groceries, even though the store sells lots of non-grocery items as well. This challenge of market definition is key to antitrust enforcement. It might seem nitpicky, but it's really important for the judge in an antitrust case to know what the relevant market is. The parties to a case will make different arguments as to what counts as being included in the relevant market. To make its case against the Kroger-Albertsons merger, the FTC has to define grocery stores pretty narrowly. Eric Fruits, a senior scholar in antitrust at the International Center for Law and Economics, broke down the FTC's argument online. The FTC in the past has defined a traditional grocery store as one that provides one-stop shopping for weekly food and grocery needs. Fruits notes that the FTC has now dropped the weekly qualifier from its definition. He says without the time period, it's hard to say what counts as one-stop shopping. The FTC also defines supermarkets as, quote, large stores that typically have at least 10,000 square feet of selling space, end quote. But Fruits notes that a typical Trader Joe's location, which is a smaller grocery store, has 10,000 square feet. And Aldi locations can be slightly larger. Fruits suspects that the definition had to be changed a little bit to shoehorn in Kroger's QFC stores, which tend to be on the smaller side. Even though they're 2,000 square feet or more, the FTC doesn't want Trader Joe's or Aldi to be considered part of the relevant market for traditional grocery stores. It excludes all the wholesale clubs and Walmart as well. It also excludes e-commerce grocery options. Not many people use e-commerce for groceries yet, so that's not a huge deal. But excluding those other ones is cutting out a large number of the places that millions of Americans go for their food and grocery needs. Now, there's a certain amount of sense to this. People do go to Costco or Trader Joe's for different products. They aren't direct competitors on many things. But that's the case right now. How will this merger between Kroger and Albertsons change the fact that people will still go to certain higher-end stores for specialty products, to more all-purpose grocery stores for normal name-brand goods, and maybe to low-price stores for generic brand staples? That's what people do now. And that undermines the one-stop shop framework that the FTC is using. The other problem the FTC will run into is that precedent is against it. Since 1988, only one grocery store merger has even been challenged in court. That was the merger between Whole Foods and Wild Oats in 2007. As a paper from the International Center for Law and Economics notes, over the last 35 years, the FTC has allowed every other supermarket merger and most retail store transactions to proceed with divestitures. The FTC's historic approach recognizes the reality that competitive concerns regarding supermarket mergers can be readily and adequately remedied by divestitures in geographic markets of concern. Indeed, even Whole Foods Wild Oats was ultimately resolved with a divestiture agreement following a fractured circuit court decision. In specific local markets where competition might be harmed, regulators can force divestiture of a handful of stores. Kroger and Albertsons market areas mostly don't overlap right now. In the handful of areas where they do, regulators could force them to sell off stores to preserve competition. That prevents the scare scenario that Elizabeth Warren and others like to hype up as happening in a town where somebody would only have one grocery store and that store can charge whatever it wants. There's no reason to be concerned about that if the merger goes through. Past mergers have solved that problem with targeted divestiture. There's no reason it wouldn't happen again this time. So it's unlikely, based on past cases, for the FTC to prevail here. That would be in continuing with the trend under Chairwoman Lina Khan. The effort by her and others to redefine antitrust law keeps running into the major problem that they can't convince federal judges that their unusual interpretations of the law and of the facts are more compelling than the established way of deciding these cases. Speaking of failure, steel and aluminum tariffs. Part of the protectionist agenda pursued by President Trump, they were first imposed in March 2018, and they've been mostly kept in place by the Biden administration. The tax rates are 25% for most imported steel and 10% for most imported aluminum. Unlike the FTC's war against mergers, the Trump administration didn't run into much interference from other branches of government. The tariffs were imposed unilaterally through the executive branch. No vote from Congress, no interference from the courts. They used supposedly national security justifications to do so. These tariffs were supposed to reinvigorate the domestic metals industry. That was what reports from 2018 from the Department of Commerce said in support of these tariffs. Well, it's been 6 years now. Have they worked? Ed Gresser of the Progressive Policy Institute looks at the results, and it turns out they haven't worked. Compared to 2017, American aluminum production was about the same in 2023, and steel production was slightly lower. That's not because the tariffs were ignored or something. They did reduce imports, and they reduced imports to roughly the same levels that the Department of Commerce wanted when it imposed the tariffs in the first place. The U.S. International Trade Commission found a brief increase in metal output in 2020 and in 2021, but that increase of $2.2 billion was overwhelmed by a $3.5 billion decrease in output by metal-consuming industries. Protectionism on input materials will always run into this problem. Way more Americans work in industries that consume steel and aluminum than in industries that produce steel and aluminum. If you're concerned about jobs, you should be concerned about the far greater number of companies that will have to pay higher prices for metal, using money that they then can't use to pay more workers. And if you're concerned about Americans' access to steel and aluminum, which is really the primary issue here, the policies are a failure. This is the real kicker from Gresser. He writes, though imports remain close to the levels the Commerce Department's 2018 reports envisioned, U.S. metal production has fallen back to pre-tariff levels. The same amount of domestic output, with fewer imports, adds up to less steel and aluminum for Americans, even though the economy today is larger than it was in 2018. The case for protectionism can be framed as the government making you a little poorer for your own good. The problem is that the making you a little poorer part usually happens, and the for your own good part usually does not. Now it's time for the paper of the episode. But before that, if you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave us a positive review wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us to know that you enjoy the show and makes the show more visible for others to start listening as well. The paper of the episode will be a recurring segment at the end of every Econception episode, where we highlight an economics paper that's worth knowing about. There are so many important papers that have shaped the discipline, and the best ones have one key idea, and for that reason can be summarized in a few minutes at the end of a podcast. For this episode, I asked John Mozena to give his recommendation. From the Journal of Economic Surveys, in 2022, by John Bradbury, Dennis Coates, and Brad Humphreys, The Impact of Professional Sports Franchises and Venues on Local Economies, a Comprehensive Survey. Here's John to tell you why it's great.
This is a great paper that was published in 2022 by three economists who have all been at various times president of the North American Association of Sports Economists. These are all professional, long-time, well-respected sports economists who study this stuff for a living. It's J.C. Bradbury at Kennesaw State University down in Georgia, Dennis Coates at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and Brad Humphreys at West Virginia University. And the title is The Impact of Professional Sports Franchises and Venues on Local Economies, a Comprehensive Survey. It was published, as I said, in 2022 in the Journal of Economic Surveys. There's also a open, ungated version on SSRN. And it does sort of what it says on the label, which was that they went and did a survey of the available academic literature, the available research on the question of the impact that professional sports franchises and stadiums have on local economies. And, right up top, they give us the answer. They say, quote, first and perhaps most important, nearly all empirical studies find little to no tangible impacts of sports teams and facilities on local economic activity, and the level of venue subsidies typically provided far exceeds any observed economic benefits. In total, the deep agreement in research findings demonstrates that sports venues are not an appropriate channel for local economic development policy, unquote. Really is true that this is an area of I know it's often sort of dangerous to say the science is settled, but on this, the economic science, the dismal science, as it were, is an agreement sort of across sort of political, socio-political, whatever spectrum you want to look at it. People of very different backgrounds, researchers of very different backgrounds of different disciplines all look at this, and there really isn't any meaningful argument against. There's no sort of argument research that comes out the other way, other than from the hired guns, as I referenced earlier, that are paid to promote this stuff. And I think that the broader conclusion that they draw is worth people understanding who care about this topic, because these are, again, economics researchers. But they say is that, unusually, they also say that the answer to this problem isn't more research, that it's not, more research is necessary, we can solve this problem with more research. The conclusion they reach is, again, quote, while we encourage researchers to continue studying the impacts of sports venues on host communities, especially using improved empirical methods in evaluating newer facilities, it is important to understand that additional research alone will be unlikely to influence public policy or public policy makers. Our survey reveals it is not a dearth of results that plagues policymaking, but instead, policymakers are not a receptive audience for this research. And they add, additional research seems unlikely to have a wider influence on policymaking, unquote. Basically, what they're saying is that politicians, elected officials aren't making decisions on these stadiums, on these subsidies, based on what the facts say. The research is really clear. Anybody who's actually looking at the data, looking at the research, looking at the real world evidence of what happens with these, they can tell they're bad. The reality is that these folks are making decisions, as public choice theory suggests that they will, based on what they think is going to be politically best for them. And for a long time, it has been they didn't want to be the politicians who were blamed for these deals. They didn't want to be the politicians who were blamed for losing the team, for not giving the team enough money that they were going to move away. The only good thing to grow out of this, I would say, is that the recent results of these things and the recent polling starts to say that, yes, the average person, even sports fans, are starting to question the size and the scope of these things. And so maybe there's a hope that that mechanism changes, that there's going to be politicians, and we're starting to see this more and more politicians who think that it's more politically advantageous to oppose these deals because of the egregious size and cost of the community. We actually say to politicians and elected officials all the time, look, the way to do this is just to put it to a vote of the people. You can cheerlead for the deal, you can take credit if it wins, and if the people vote it down, it's not your fault. This research says that that's probably the best way to go about it. That's the best way to try to drive change in it. It's sort of depressing to say that's a problem that can't just be solved by research, but it is good to know that it's at least something that this is at least one thing that economics knows to be true and that they're not going to argue about.
All right. Thanks so much, John.
Thank you.
The Impact of Professional Sports Franchises and Venues on Local Economies, from Bradbury, Coates, and Humphreys. Read it. That's all for today. Remember, the economy is complicated, and nobody has all the answers, but markets work.